Hello everyone and thank you for joining me. If you recall, in the previous video we set up a basic UI and an empty menu manager script, empty menu manager game object, and an empty game object to hold our selection when scrolling through our prefabs. Now in this video we're going to be putting it all together. We'll begin with programming our UI logic and covering how to select our game objects through an array while using player prefs to keep track of our selection. Let's get started by adding our menu manager script to our empty menu manager game object in the hierarchy. Then just double click on the script to open it. Once we have the script open, go ahead and create a public array of game objects. And I'm just going to call mine selectable characters, but feel free to name yours whatever you feel like. And let's see here, we're going to go with public game object array, and it's going to be selectable characters for mine, like I mentioned earlier. Also, we want to create an integer variable. You can declare it as public, private, static. It really doesn't matter for the purposes of this tutorial. I'm using static because I may be covering another method that doesn't utilize player prefs in the future as a follow-up to this tutorial. And I'm going with selected character for the name. Once we have these variables in place, we're going to go ahead and jump back into editor and set up our array of game objects. And once you're back in the editor, you want to go ahead and select the main menu game manager object that we did earlier, and the script component should be attached. Just go ahead and set the size to 4 since we have 4 game objects in our prefabs folder that we're going to be using. Go ahead and press enter. You should have 4 empty element slots available now. So head into the prefab folder and start dragging and dropping your prefabs into the empty element slots of the array. And I just wanted to make a quick note. Essentially whatever game objects we place in our array is what we're going to be looping through with the selected character integer we created in the menu manager script. I'm going to go ahead and fill mine up. Just bear with me here. So let's jump back into our menu manager script in Visual Studios to expand upon it. I'm going to go ahead and set up our player prefs. For this, I always like to start in the awake function, which gets called before start. For those of you who haven't worked with player prefs before, essentially it's just a key value pair, and in Unity's case, you give a string value for the name, which will be its key, then whatever value we want to store. Now, whenever I use player prefs, I like to call hasKey first, and I like using the name of the variable that's going to work with the player pref when setting it like so. If hasKey returns true, then we don't have to worry about setting or creating the player pref, and we can take its value to set it to our integer value. This way, if the player turns off the game and then returns at a later time, the same game object selected will be displayed first instead of the first element in the array. I'll demonstrate this later on. To set the integer value to the current player pref value, just use playerprefs.getInt, similar to how we used hasKey. Make sure to use the correct spelling with the spring. In another video, I'll go over how to avoid errors when having to deal with strings that are going to be used multiple times. In the event that hasKey returns false, meaning the player pref hasn't been created yet, this is where we'll want to create it so we can use it later on. To create a player pref, it's pretty straightforward. You just want to call playerprefs.setInt, similar to hasKey or getInt, but this function takes 2 arguments. The first is the string name, which we established, and the second is going to be the value you want to initialize it to. So I'm just going to go ahead and initialize it to the integer value we created earlier, which I set to 0, so the player will start at the first element in the array. Now that we have set up our player pref, that we'll be using with our integer, let's move on and jump back into Unity real quick. And we can see that we still have some things to work on, starting with our buttons. So let's jump back into the script to create those public methods for the next, previous, and start button so we can control the UI. These are going to be very standard button methods. For those of you who are new to buttons, the reason we want to use public methods is so the buttons in the editor can access the methods. I will go over how to link the buttons to the methods in the editor in a bit, but first let's focus on the incrementing and decrementing logic. And I'm just going to give them the same name as the buttons that will be utilizing them. Previous button will be responsible for decrementing, and next will be responsible for incrementing. So let's just do a very basic increment with a simple check to make sure we won't go out of bounds of the array. We only want to be able to increment if our selected character integer is less than the length of our array. Otherwise, we want to set the integer back to 0, which will bring the selection back to the first element in the array. So for setting the selection back to 0, just check to make sure if our integer value is greater than or equal to the array length, and if so, set it to 0. In update, I'm going to run a quick log to display this and make sure it's working before linking it to the actual array. Just debug.log the integer value and we'll link up the button in the editor. So what we should see is the log going from 0, 1, 2, 3 for the integer value as we press the increment button, and then back to 0 once we get to the last element in that array. Let's test this and catch some bugs if any. In order to link up the buttons to the corresponding methods, we have to navigate to our buttons in the hierarchy. Select the next button and then in the inspector, scroll down to the on click section and press the plus sign. Now you should see a section displaying the word none. That's where we want to drag our main menu game object holding the script because it has our methods for the buttons. Now once that's in place, press the drop down arrow and select menu manager or whatever you named that game object and select the next button method. I went ahead and hit play to see what we get, and okay, so I do have a bug kinda. I placed the logic for the next button in the previous method and vice versa, so just switch it around and we'll test again. Just cut and paste and jump back into Unity. Hit play and press the next button continuously and you should be going from 0, 1, 2, 3 and back to 0. Let's just make sure things are working properly before we proceed. That seems to be working fine for me on my end, so now we can go ahead and add some checks to the previous button. Back in Visual Studio, we want to make sure we can't go in the negative, so when our selection integer equals 0 and we press that button again, we can't go to -1. Instead, we should go back to the last element in the array, which in our case equals 3. So if the integer is greater than 0, we can decrement, and if the integer is less than or equal to 0 when pressing the button, we should just go back to the last element in the array. So to finish up the previous button method, I'm just going to copy over the logic from the next button method and modify it to meet our needs. The first condition, like I mentioned, if greater than 0, we want to be able to continue to decrement. And if we're at the first element in the array, meaning we're at 0, when we hit the previous button, we want to be able to go to the last element in the array. Go ahead and set the integer you're using to the last element in the array for this if statement. I'm going to write this out as if our integer is equal to or less than 0, then set it to the array length, but you can use equal instead of less than or equal to. Doesn't really matter. Let's test this and see if it works. Bear with me here while I link everything up in Unity. Once the previous button is linked up, hit play and hopefully we don't get any errors. And let's see here. Okay, so we do start off at 0, then we go from 0 to 4, 3, 2, 1. But it does seem like I made a mistake. So I didn't set the integer value to the last element in the array, but rather the length of the array. This is a simple fix, so we're going to head back into Visual Studios. And back in Visual Studios, just change the integer from equaling the length of the array to equaling the length of the array minus 1. I went ahead and did it, but the recording isn't capturing it, so go ahead and do it on your end. I also want to change the method from having 2 if statements to having an if-else statement instead. That way only one if condition gets executed when pressing the button. We don't have to worry about this for the other method, but you can change it as well, and we'll test again. 0, 3, 2, 1, back to 0. All seems to be working as we're going from 0 through 1, back to 0 when pressing the previous button. So thanks for watching, and in the next one we're going to expand upon this, so I'll catch you then. And I appreciate you guys joining me.